Welcome. This is Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're all about geeking out on what fuels authors and artists. We want to dive into imposter syndrome, those nagging doubts even the most talented creatives feel, and explore how it pops up in their lives. We'll be having real talks about creativity and self-doubt with writers and creatives across mediums.
Hello. Well, typically, this will be the part where we introduce our fabulous guest of the day. But for our first episode, we figured we would interview each other. And we are going to do it in the style that we actually write. As you'll come to find out, if you don't already know, we are writing partners. And when we write a book together, we volley. So we'll go back and forth. So Greg, I'll ask you a question, you ask me a question, and we'll see what comes of that. So without further ado, I am very excited to announce one of today's guests, Greg Wands, who is my co-host, my co-author, and my friend of 25 years. And he is the internationally best-selling co-author, along with myself, of 3 thriller novels under the pen name E.G. Scott, the first of which was optioned for television. Our books have been translated into 12 languages and have been featured in Entertainment Weekly, BuzzFeed, Real Simple, and In Style. Our forthcoming title, Trust Issues, is due from Dutton Books in 2025. Greg also co-wrote the audio novella, The Gimlet Slip, with Fiona Davis, which is so awesome. I highly recommend it. And he spends his days between New York City and Westchester County. Welcome,
Thank you.
Greg.
Thank you very much, Liz. And if I may now return the favor. For our listeners out there, Elizabeth Keenan is an internationally best-selling novelist, ghostwriter, editor, and a 2-decade-long publishing veteran. She's also the founder of Campfire Lit, an author services agency, which I would highly recommend to anyone looking. Under the pseudonym of E.G. Scott, Elizabeth co-authored 3 internationally best-selling novels, all published by Dutton. During her nearly 20 years working in-house, she held positions at multiple imprints within 3 of the big 5 publishers, including Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, and Macmillan. Liz, welcome to your own show. And if that is not the perfect way to kick off a show, which is going to be centering largely around imposter syndrome, I'm not sure what else is. Welcome to your show.
Thank you. And welcome to yours.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just get into questions, but I want to say for the record, I'm having major imposter syndrome about doing a podcast. So
Perfect. It's good. I think we'll just approach this endeavor the way we did with our first book, is we had really no idea what we were doing, and we just kind of faked it till we made it, which
we'll muddle through.
Yeah, the further I go in life and in the publishing industry and any other facet of the world, I realize that's mostly what it is, right? Is everyone's just kind of pretending that they know what they're doing?
Yeah. I think? Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think part of what we want to do with this podcast and what inspired us to do it is we've just been realizing with all of our artist and writer friends and just life friends, like everyone has a shade of imposter syndrome about something in their life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, what do you hope to accomplish with this podcast, which is in a sea of hundreds and thousands of other podcasts, many of which talk about imposter syndrome and or con artists?
This is very true. Well, to your point, the more we talk about, I feel like as we have gotten further into the community around authors and around thriller authors, but the writing community as a whole, that it really is a thing that happens. I don't know if it happens at the same degree outside of the creative arts that it does within the creative arts, this idea of imposter syndrome, because I feel like, in some careers, there are those benchmarks that you are demonstrable as you go along. You get a raise, you get a title bump, you get the corner office, they give you the gold watch. With the creative endeavors, it's not really that way. You have you're muddling along and then hopefully things break well and you get, in our case, a book published, but
right.
That it's not necessarily, that doesn't guarantee an upward trajectory as you go. There are, there can be bumps along the road. You can get kind of pushed back. You can have a book that comes out where the timing doesn't line up well with sales, all kinds of things can happen. So
right.
It's not really a straight trajectory in the way that I think maybe it is that way. And the more we talk to other creatives, other authors, and so forth, it does seem like everyone has some version of imposter syndrome. So I think that, to your initial question, I would love with this podcast to really just build community and to talk more with other people who are going through the same thing, and hopefully give people a forum to be able to have those conversations, very candid conversations, and to be able to feel community, to be able to get that sense that they're not alone, and that everyone, whether you're an unpublished author who's sending out your first manuscript or whether you're 10 books in, probably most of the people around you are dealing with some sort of, version of that same thing.
Yeah.
How about yourself? What are your kind of aims and goals with this?
Well, I think, everything you said is spot on, connecting with other writers, feeling, a degree of identification always helps me feel kind of less alone in experiences. And, the imposter syndrome part of the podcast, we're saying from syndrome to swindlers. So we're covering kind of this wide swath. But I think there is a lot of, interrelatedness to these concepts. One is kind of self-deception. You're convinced that you are not good enough, or people are going to find out that you're a fraud. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you're a con artist, you're deceiving others and you're overly confident. And I kind of like the dichotomy of that. And I think with the podcast, this really came out of, we were writing this book, Trust Issues, for the last year.
Right.
It's about a family that is affected by a con artist and what they do with that trauma. And you and I spent so much time just immersing ourselves in what con artistry is and what deception is. And then I think within that, we also wrote these characters that all in their own ways have major imposter syndrome. And I think that, speaking for myself, I am still living in all of the research and character development and that world we created. And I want to talk more about it with people. I want to talk to writers and artists who have imposter syndrome and how they deal with it, like practically. And I want to talk to people who've had real life experiences with being scammed, because I think that experience is really difficult, and it's important to have, commiseration, camaraderie. In the course of the podcast, we'll talk about some real life experiences and how isolating it can be. So I like the idea of kind of braiding the two ideas together. Yeah, and absolutely. Seeing what comes from the stories, right? Because at the end of the day, we love stories and we love storytellers. Oh, yeah. And it's a great writing prompt, right? Like, what, where does imposter syndrome and or con artists fall into your life? And just like all of the amazing storytellers we already know and the ones we want to know. Yeah. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I love that. So let's you and I kick off and lead by example here, right? Okay. What would you say for you? What area of your life do you find imposter syndrome bubbling up the most?
I think for a long time it was, and I'm just going to give a little context because you and I have known each other for so long, and we've known each other since college, and that was like the root of my imposter syndrome, was going to theater school for acting. And I totally felt like an imposter from the moment I bombed my first audition. Like I bombed my audition so badly that I had to call them the next day and say, can I re-audition? Yeah. And I got in, but from the jump, I was like, I don't belong here. Yeah. And, so it was college, it was acting, it was graduating with a theater degree, and then realizing, I'm not a good enough actor, or I don't want it enough. And then I went right into a career in publishing because the other thing I wanted to do as much as theater was write. So then I was in this incredible industry where I was working with books and brilliant people for no money and trying to be a writer on the side. So I felt like I was a fraud. I wasn't completely a publishing person because I hadn't gotten an English degree. I hadn't done any of the prestigious publishing interns. internships. And,
Right.
I felt like a fraud as a writer because I had a 9-to-5 job. So the reason I bring these things up is because in both of those instances, I guess I had this fantasy that when I finally was able to write full time and, not have to be in school or not be in a 9-to-5, I would lose the imposter syndrome because I would be doing the thing I wanted to do the most.
Right.
And when we published The Woman Inside, which we were, so lucky to get a book deal with Dutton and a 2-book deal, which scared the crap out of me because I'm like, oh, we have to do this again.
Right. Yep.
I realized, the sitting down and the writing, I would sit down and I would be like, who do you think you are? What are you doing? How are you going to pull this off? And then when we got the book deal, it was like, okay, you did it well enough to do that part of it. And then when we just start to promote the book, that was really when the imposter syndrome kicked in, full force.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about it, but as you well know, as my writing partner, I love the writing part about writing, but being an author is really hard for me. The kind of outward facing, the promoting.
Sure.
And, I'll kind of leave my answer there because I don't want to drone on and on. But so currently the imposter syndrome is kicking up for me a lot right now, especially with trust issues going, which will be published in about 6 months, because we are not writing that book under our pen name. Our actual names are going to be on the cover. So there's no hiding behind the pen name.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. There's a level of transparency, I guess, that we were didn't have on the first few books.
Right.
Yeah.
What about you? Where is imposter syndrome flaring up for you the most?
Well, you bring up a really good point that I hadn't thought about in this way, but there is that thing with authors. In my experience, speaking with authors, getting to know authors and becoming friends with authors, that's another thing. It's actually, this is going to be a several prong answer, because there's a part of it where also now over the last couple of years, going to Thriller Fest and some of the conventions and going to author events and things like that. We're just out at Hampton's Whodunit this spring. And there's suddenly this thing where I'm in a room with people who I admire, whose work I admire. And then it occurs to me oh, these are colleagues, but that still seems wild to me.
Yeah.
Some of these people are people that I was reading before you and I had a book deal, or maybe we're even writing The Woman Inside, and so suddenly I'm like, wait, these are people, I'm in a room with these people. This is, somebody made a mistake, right?
Right.
So that's already odd. So there's just, you're right, being in the room with people. I mean, even before you get up to being on a panel or speaking or trying to pitch your book or whatever, just being in the same sort of, in my mind, rarefied air of these people who I've admired for years, or who I've admired maybe recently, people who are coming out. I'll read a debut and it floors me, and then suddenly I'm in a room watching a panel with this person. I'm like, what am I doing here? Right. So that's part of it. The other part, going back to what you said a few minutes ago, there's also this thing that I feel like with most authors, I know for me and for you and a lot that I talk to, I feel like most of us deep down are introverts. So there's also this imposter aspect of being an introvert who has to then occasionally pretend to be an extrovert for a couple hours at a time.
Right.
We, all of us, when we're pitching books, we have to go and, put on a suit or whatever and go up and talk like we, know what we're doing and kind of do everything. And there's a part of me that does actually love, again, the community aspect I love. But I think it's all of the things about being naturally an introvert and then also feeling like I don't necessarily belong in the spaces with some of these other people. So those are interesting things. And then also,
wait, can I stop you just 1 second? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
I love that you said get up in a suit, because I'm like, have you ever worn a suit to any one of our events?
I think maybe once. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Maybe not. Well, a shirt with buttons and a collar on it.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Fair.
Yeah. Tailored pants.
I'm like, now you have to wear a suit to every event.
I got to wear a suit. I've painted myself into a corner on this podcast. This is good. Yeah. We're not even one episode in, and I've made life exponentially more difficult for me professionally. Great. Oh God, you want
Raise
to
the bar.
you
Raise
want
the
to just
bar.
you just want to give in to the imposter syndrome and just call this thing off right now, about 15 minutes into
Yes.
recording. So anyway, so there's all of that stuff. Then also, let's see. Yeah, we're going into yet another book cycle where we've turned into a book we've managed to write together, which I think is amazing. And also
Yeah.
kind of, it's funny. It's you look back on it and it's almost the whole thing feels like a fever dream
Yeah.
in a way. So it's like, oh wow, this book, it's almost like this book is written. It almost to me feels not like we wrote this book. It almost feels like, wow, this book's written. Because going back and thinking about it, it's these little sort of weird spurts of, again, feverish kind of almost out of body, right?
Yeah.
When it's going well, you're in this flow state, right? So you don't even, there are times when I'll go back a couple days later to read over stuff that I read or that I wrote a couple days ago, and I barely remember writing it,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so part of that's also interesting. Another thing that you mentioned earlier, I want to touch on again is, both you and I, neither of us went through the MFA route, right?
Yeah.
So that also, I think, I learned to be a writer basically from being a reader. I know you largely did as well. We've had that conversation. So there's another aspect where I still consider myself almost a reader before I consider myself a writer, because that's pretty much how I learned how to write.
Yeah.
So there's that thing that also adds to the imposter syndrome, because it's not like I go in when I'm thinking about a chapter, for instance, with one of our books. I don't really go in with, there's no template. I don't really have a list of writing rules. A lot of it is intuitive. The way you and I write the books is intuitive. As you said, we volley back and forth. So we'll go in with a pretty broad outline. And then even with the outline, a lot of things change as we go. I mean, on trust issues, for instance, I think we more or less changed the third act in that book once we sort of got going. Right. And started knowing the characters more, character motivations, where these things might take themselves, how these characters would interact. And so there's also that thing of writing by the seat of your pants, right? Pantsers, as people are sometimes referred to in the writing world, and not really having any framework or template for this is how one writes, or this is how I write. So it's almost every time I sit down at the desk, it seems like I'm just trying to figure it out as I go, right? So that's another thing. Another thing you're aware of, for my own experience personally, I've talked to you about this, obviously, and I have not shared this with a whole lot of other people, but I also recently submitted my first solo novel, which did not sell. So for me, there's also that thing of, I've been writing with you, which is fantastic. And then I had this other idea, and I was sort of writing, I think the way it worked out is when the pandemic hit, there was that low level of anxiety floating around. And I had this idea of, I really want to be writing something every day just to keep my mind concentrated, right, on something. I came up with this idea. I started working on it. The way I would do it is you and I have the volley style. So I'll write a chapter, kick it to you, you'll write yours, kick it back. So there's always a few days in there when you have the chapters when I'm not actively working on something.
Right.
So I started working this idea out, started getting a bit of traction on it, wrote it, had a full manuscript, sent it out, went to our wonderful agent, Christopher. He gave me some great notes, and we went with that and put together, an editor list and did the whole bit, and then sent it out, and it didn't sell.
Right.
So that's also another component of me feeling like, can I do this? Is this, do I not have the instincts on my own? So there's just a lot of those moving parts that I guess throw doubt into the mix on a pretty regular basis, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. By the way, I loved that novel.
Thank you.
It was incredible, beautifully written. And, having worked on the publishing side of things, a book not selling does not mean it's not a good book. I think we will probably have many guests, hopefully, in the coming months that have had some version of that experience, and I think this is one of the things about writing that's so hard, this like high risk of investing all of the time and the effort and the vulnerability into creating an entire book. And then it's just not met with the response or reaction that we hope for or expect. It's like, how do you reconcile that? How do you not take it personally?
Right.
And, to relate to what you're saying, similarly, I feel imposter syndrome about ever being able to write a book by myself, because I've only ever published, full length works with you, which is amazing. And,
Right.
I'm sure we'll talk more in the course of things about why we did that and why we continue to do that. But, I've been working on a novel for 20 years.
Right.
Like,
Right. Yeah. Well,
and
I have. I'm just going to give our readers a little Easter egg on this one. I have read the first chunk of it, and it is fantastic. So I know that there is more of that magic to come.
Can you also promise you'll buy 25,000 copies of it if it ever gets published?
Let's see how Trust Issues does.
Yeah, right.
I'm willing to take some of the back end off that book. I mean, if we really start cranking with the residuals, I'm willing to reinvest. I look at this all as just reinvestment on the same.
Yeah, we could just let's just circle the wagons and we'll all buy huge quantities of each other's books, and then sustain our careers. Which sometimes it feels like we are, when we don't get a lot of response otherwise. Sure. But I did want to ask you, because you brought up your first novel. I hope it's okay I'm bringing it up, but you're working on your second novel.
Yes.
Solo.
Yep.
So how was that, kind of coming off of the previous novel, it not having sold? How did you feel like going into the second one? What was that process like?
Ooh, there was a lot of trepidation involved in that. Also, there's the thing of, as you said, and thank you for being so supportive a few minutes ago about, how much you love the book. There's also that difference too with, I think, understanding, especially I think when you're in a creative endeavor, of understanding something intellectually versus feeling something emotionally, right? Intellectually, I can look at that first book that didn't sell and say, oh, well, the writing is, the prose is good. I think the construction is solid. I think the twist works. There are those things. And you and a very small other group of people who have read it and given great feedback. So I think intellectually I can say, oh, okay, well, this is, I can feel good about that book. But the emotional aspect of having to look at, stare that thing down consistently, right? There's also that fear. I know for myself, when I sit down to write anything, I always have to do a number of other things to get myself kind of prepped to do it, to really get into the headspace. And I think that's fear, right? A lot of that is just getting out of your own way and giving yourself the permission. And that's getting around the fear, which I think is ever present. And it's probably a good motivator in some ways. I think fear can be a really good motivator. And I think maybe having a bit of a chip on your shoulder from having a situation where like you didn't sell something that you believed in can be a good motivator, right?
Right.
As long as, I think the trick is to not let those things, to not become too weighed down or bogged down or encumbered by those feelings. It's sort of use those as fuel as opposed to letting them be the thing that drags you under, so to speak, right? Yeah. So I think going into the second one, probably in a way it was a blessing, because going into the second one, I had a really good idea. I was very inspired by the thought. And then I thought, okay, I have to make this thing unimpeachable, right? This has to be bulletproof so that I don't run into the same thing with the first book. So I went in, I dove in, I did probably a year of research on this thing. And I don't really map out things that I know you and I have talked in interviews and in conversations with each other, how it's more like scaffolding around the building, right? We have this kind of tend to work in 3 acts for our books, and we tend to have a general shape of what it's going to be, and these sort of points that we stop at or hit upon as we go.
Right.
And then as we get to know more of the story and the characters and everything else, that starts to speak for itself, and we start to follow that a little bit. It was the same with this, but I did feel like I went in with a notebook full of research. So I had all of this stuff, and I thought, okay, I went in, I did a character Bible for the 5 main characters, all of whom have not a first person, close third POV. So when I went in, I had a couple pages worth of what are these people's, fears and wants and desires, and what motivates them, and what are they, where do their allegiances lie, and what are their deepest traumas, and all those kind of things, right? So I went in, so I felt very good about that. And I was kind of writing with a little bit of a grudge, and I think that helped. I think that
Yes.
helped a little bit. The thing with that, the danger you get into that with that, and you and I have talked about this in other capacities, is to then not fall into that trap where you let your ego
Mhm.
get the best of you. So it
Right.
was keeping that out of it as much as possible and letting it be about the work, but then also just being motivated to say, all right, this is going to be the one that works. This is going to be the one that sells. So that was definitely, yeah, I think going into the second one, I was trying to be motivated to make sure that I went in a way where, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I mean,
Hmm.
all of this is, of course, a big crapshoot at the end of it.
Right.
When you're working on a book. If you haven't sold the book already and you're writing it on spec, which essentially I am with this one, but I think that at the end of the process, I'm getting pretty close. I think I'm about 10,000 words out in terms of having at least a pretty solid first draft manuscript.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I think in answer to your question, I've been trying to use it more as motivation. The first one not selling, rather than given to the fear of, oh, I'm not good enough to be able to do this on my own.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. I'm really impressed that you're able to stay, optimistic and motivated. And, based on what you've told me about the book you're working on now, it's just one of those projects that is asking to be written. Like, you're not writing it to get published. I know that that's in your mind, and I know that the kind of orientation of sitting down to write once you've been published once or multiple times, I think does change a little bit, because, it's hard to not think as you're sitting down each day, like, is this sellable? Is this marketable? Is this something my agent will like or my readers will like? But to be able to just sit down and write it, because it's speaking to you. I mean, I don't know about you, this may be idealizing it. But I still try and do it for that experience,
Do you feel like you've been able to do that with the solo project you're working on? Do you feel like when you're actually sitting at the desk that you're able to have that be your motivator, your energy?
Yes and no. The biggest struggle with that book is, while it's not a memoir, it's writing about things that are very close to my life. And I have a lot of fear around, I think people thinking it's me.
Right.
And it's not a thriller in the traditional sense, but it's, I think you tell me, I think it's kind of literary horror. They're basically horror stories about recovery and about addiction.
Oh, yeah.
And, it's a book that I've been working on at various points of my life, kind of most, I think, crucially, my own recovery journey.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of baggage with that.
Sure.
But, you and I think one of the reasons we became writing partners, we started out as kind of reading partners and then writing partners, is this idea that you can use writing as a means for working through stuff and healing.
Absolutely.
And for that book in particular, my solo project, every time I sit down to write it, it's kind of writing me, for better or for worse.
I like that. Yeah.
And it's wild what kind of comes out when you black out when you're writing.
Yeah.
And so some of it I want to keep on the page, but I'm a little afraid to put out there, because I think that readers' responses, or if it doesn't sell, it would be really hard to not take it personally.
Sure. Yeah, when it feels that personal to you.
Right. Yeah. But, this is one day at a time. I can't, I can't apply all of the symptoms of, imposter syndrome and perfectionism and not feeling good enough, I think with this project while I'm writing it, because that's what's kept me from finishing it. I mean, that and many years in between when I wasn't in the mindset, that I could sit down and do it fully.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
But, now that we're talking about it on the podcast, and there feels like an even greater degree of accountability.
Well, that's the nice thing about this. I think that the nice thing about having this podcast, and also I found one of the wonderful things again about the author community is that when you do finally get the nerve to share some things about an idea you've been hashing through or a book that maybe you're in the process of writing, then suddenly there is that accountability built in. So then there's like, okay, well, there's, someone's maybe halfway curious about this book being finished,
right,
and
right.
taking a look at it down the road at some point. So that's nice. That can be a really great motivator for that.
Right. Yeah. And this is why, when you and I write together, I get my pages done because I feel like I've made a promise to you.
Yes.
That, I'm going to get something done so that you can do what you need to do with it. And I do think that whether it's a writing partnership, a romantic partnership, a professional one, there is a certain symbiotic relationship that you have to have accountability to each other, yes, or it just doesn't work. And then the same with being a writer and a reader. I feel like we have accountability to our readers. That.
Well, there is that. It's almost, if you look at the thought of being a published author, it's almost like you have a contract with your readers, right? You're going in, you're trying to give your readers the best version of that story. You're trying to give them the most, well-developed plot, the most shocking twists, the most well-developed characters, things that pull you in story-wise. And I think there is. So if you look at it that way, it's almost, you're almost in service to the story in a way that is accountable to the readers. And it is kind of if you have that contract mentality around it, I think that can be helpful with accountability. And also, as you say, I know I'm by nature a procrastinator. So having had now several years of accountability with you on now 4 books, that's also, it's like accountability boot camp, right? We really have got, and I feel like in other aspects of my life, I'm more accountable, and some of that for sure goes back to and is rooted in you and I having this relationship, this professional, creative, and friend-based relationship.
Right.
So that's helpful.
Right. And also, I think that I'm a people pleaser.
Sure. Yeah.
And this is where leveraging that, character challenge is, really effective. The same way, being perfectionistic, a symptom of imposter syndrome I was reading, I think I told you on email, is over preparedness, which is my hallmark. I'm already, there's a story that I'll share really quickly that is perfect over preparedness. When I was moving out of the city, after living there for 25 years, we had movers coming, and I was so anxious, I think just about moving in general, that my husband and I pre-wrapped everything in the apartment, basically got giant saran wrap, and, so the drawers wouldn't come out, so things wouldn't get broken. And it took 8 hours. It was insanity. And the movers show up, and the first thing they do is take out an X-Acto knife and start slashing everything open.
Okay.
Because, of course, they have the way that they do it. And, why I thought that I could control that situation with hundreds of dollars worth of, saran wrap. It's just
and even more in actual man hours.
Right.
Yeah.
So whenever I kind of get into that space of wanting to be over prepared so that I can feel like I have control, I just remind myself, that's shorthand around my house. It's pre-wrap.
Pre-wrap, right. Yeah.
So.
Well, it's interesting. And you talk about this idea, and this is something that I really lean into and am continuously fascinated by with the actual writing process, which is the idea of control, the illusion of control, right? And this idea of going in to a story knowing what the story is going to be, and then once the characters start talking to you, the characters start telling the story. So then it's like, as you said, which I loved a few minutes ago, the story's writing you at a certain point, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, let's jump into another aspect of our podcast, which is the idea of the sort of imposter villain character that we certainly have been writing in books and are absolutely leaning into very heavily on trust issues on our latest one.
Yeah.
What's I don't know if you want to talk about the process of writing them, what the motivations are, the fun aspects of getting into that kind of headspace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know one of the things we really wanted to do with the talking to authors and creators when they come on is, what is kind of appealing about these problematic characters who are imposters, unreliable narrators, villains, give them whatever label. And yeah, I mean, I think why do we write thrillers and we write about murder and fraud and deceit instead of military history or romance,
Right. Yeah.
And I think about that a lot as far as, what do I choose to consume? And mostly I read horror, I read thrillers, I read memoir, and certainly that's a lot of what I watch. So I'm making a conscious decision to kind of be in a state of, I don't want to say entirely negativity, because I think in our books, certainly in a lot of other books that I've read, the negativity or the hard situations are necessary to kind of get towards the conclusion. And oftentimes there's a big, lesson or outcome that feels really satisfying.
Sure.
You get a real hero's journey experience.
Yeah.
So I guess looking at the why, I find that writing characters who are imposters in every sense of the word make for a really interesting writing experience as far as what we've been talking about. Like when the character is speaking to you and kind of telling you their story,
right.
I find that the more complex, duplicitous characters are the ones that, to me, speak more interestingly.
Yeah.
And I like being in that space of understanding why people do the things they do and why they are the way they are.
Right.
The psychological motivations.
Yeah.
And I think that the characters we tend to and read and write are, the kind of quintessential characters of unreliability, duplicity, duality. No one is straightforward in the worlds that we write about.
Right.
And I think that for me, that comes from very early on having experiences in my own life, encountering people who were complex, duplicitous, mentally ill, what have you. And my way to kind of understand and unpack those experiences is to do it through writing these characters and maybe, speculating on real life experiences through these fictional characters.
Do you find does that end up being a cathartic exercise sometimes for you in terms of?
Yeah, I think certainly it's cathartic in the sense that if I can have a fully formed character and then bring them around to some kind of humanity, I think there's a degree in which, like, myself as a writer and a human can understand, empathize, and forgive. Like I get really close to our characters, especially this most recent book. And we wrote we wrote trust issues in a different point of view than we usually do. So in our first 3 books, we were in first person, and that really gave this sense of, like, am I this character?
Right. Yeah.
It became a little like method acting, not in the sense that like we were killing people, but really getting into their psyche.
As far as the people out there know.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Perfect cover. But with trust issues, there's a kind of close third that, I don't know, it was a little bit more voyeuristic and trying to figure out those characters' motivations and then the kind of change and the twists throughout was really satisfying, both as an author and of course to read your stuff fresh, because I don't know what's going on half the time. When you send me a chapter, it's like totally new to me.
Well, that's the gift that we're able to give one another, which is half of the magic of this partnership.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's like reading a really good book in real time. I
like that. Yeah.
What about for you? What do you think it is about these characters that keeps you writing them?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the change in POV, because that's something I've been thinking about recently. And I think that trust issues probably got me thinking about it even more so, which is one of those tropes that you mentioned in thriller fiction, which at this point has been, maybe somewhat even shop worn, but the idea of the unreliable narrator, right? And the unreliable narrator for a long time now has usually been in reference to someone who's somehow either addled through drugs or some sort of a psychological condition or something like that, where it's intentionally the let's say objective reality is intentionally obfuscated for the purposes of the drama and the tension and then the big reveal in the thriller, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing about unreliable narrators to me that's become more and more interesting is how much each of us is actually an unreliable narrator in our own lives, right? I mean, none of us have an objective viewpoint about our own, the whole two sides to every story thing. Right. That's a saying because all of us are informed on some level by our confirmation bias, by our experiences, by our various viewpoints and assumptions and things like that. So the thing that's become really fascinating to me about the idea of the unreliable narrator is not the unreliable narrator necessarily someone who has a drug addiction and is therefore addled by whatever that outside force is. It's more the little things, the minutia and the nuance, and how each of us is an unreliable narrator. And when you're going into third person, there's an interesting thing that you're able to do then where you can kind of unlock narrative irony in an interesting way, where this person is going along, perhaps laboring under some sort of false pretense, whereas the reader can then see, because of that level of removal, where maybe that is true and where it's not so true. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting in terms of character studies and from the perspective of that. Another thing that occurred to me as I was just thinking about our conversation today was that the idea of this book that we're doing now that will be out, Trust Issues, we're going specifically into cons and imposters in a very big way, in a very overt way. We're really tackling that one head on. But something that occurred to me is that in a way we've been kind of doing that from the start. And by that, what I mean is the character of Paul from The Woman Inside, our first book, he's dealing with this case of survivor's guilt, right? And survivor's guilt, as I was parsing this in my head, is almost the flip side of the coin of imposter syndrome, right? You're dealing with these two conditions where you're asking yourself, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Right. And why not this other person? And what's the, what like that to me is interesting, because in a way we've sort of been through lining that in slightly different ways now throughout our writing careers together. So it was something that kind of popped into my head. I thought, oh, that's interesting. This is not a huge departure from where we kind of started out to where we are now. And it's sort of symbolic in that was our first book together with our pen name, our recently retired pen name. And this is now Trust Issues will be our first book, as you mentioned, with our names. So there's a bit of a transitional period or aspect to it. But there are some things that have echoed throughout. So
that's a great observation. I'm still kind of reeling now because I'm thinking about in case of emergency, there's survivor's guilt happening there.
Sure.
the rule of three. I
Yeah.
mean, I have survivor's guilt in my own life, having
Yeah.
lost a good friend in high school, that has stayed with me, and all of the people who knew her, and, certainly her family and other friends. I don't have the monopoly on that grief, but,
Of course.
that's one of the formative things in my life that I've definitely written through with you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I hadn't thought about it to that degree. Do you have that experience too? Do you think that there are things that have happened in your early life that keep coming up?
Oh, for sure. I mean, part of this is, you mentioned earlier about your experience with recovery. My background, I come from a family where there's addiction in our family history. And I
Yeah.
think that there are certainly a lot of aspects where there's that comes with, let me say that kind of history comes with a lot of behaviors that sort of echo what we write about in a way, right? There's deception
Mhm.
and there's obfuscation and there's all sorts of ways in which a lot of people are not only lying to others, but lying to yourself, right? So that's
Yeah.
a lot of that's a really, I mean, that's kind of a fascinating background to come from to then write. I mean, to your point, there's probably a reason why I'm not writing Regency dramas right now, right? Um, so yeah, I think there's all kinds of things that,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we are all probably as authors, as artists, as creatives, working through a lot of the same things,
Mhm.
over the
For sure.
course of your, let's say, body of work, right? Or your hours at the desk. Or just, really the way I mean, you and I have been friends for as long as we have. And I think part of the reason probably we became friends in the first place and kind of found each other
Mm.
at Marymount, where we were both studying theater, is probably, you have that shorthand with people. You understand people sometimes on a very elemental level
Right.
when those people have similar maybe upbringings or backgrounds or are wired largely the same way. And so, I think all of this, if you really look back on it objectively, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
is kind of getting my brain gears going. Do you feel like you've had experiences in your life with real imposters, whether, overt or kind of subtly, and, we don't have to name names,
You're right.
but I think, part of what you're talking about with our experiences informing, what we kind of work through in our art.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly this has come up for me a lot,
Yeah.
con artists, scammers, fraud.
Yeah.
So I have some ideas about where that comes from for me, and certainly with trust issues. But what about you?
Well, I think that, yeah, I've never had, for instance, I've never, as far as I know, been the victim of a con, a long con, a short con, anything like that. I don't know people who have been conned out of money or have had a very, um, let's say, dramatic experience with that. But I
Mhm.
think it does fall a little more on the subtle end of the scale of, probably, yeah, in ways that are more minute and more shadings of experiences. Have been, there's been deception and sort of con artistry along the way. So it all makes sense. And I think it's trust issues almost feels like a lot of that stuff just scaled up into a more
Right.
obvious type of vehicle for that. But yeah, I would say absolutely, without having any really dramatic examples to throw your way. I think that coming up the way that I
Well,
did,
second part of my question is, having now written trust issues and kind of learning everything that we learned
yeah,
from all of the reading and watching and listening,
yeah.
do you feel differently about how you operate in the world? Are you more or less suspicious, skeptical, careful, etc.?
Well, it's interesting because there's in the research that we did, there's a lot about this is how you kind of spot a con.
Mhm.
These are the things to look out for, and all that. But there's also, I've also come across people who are talking about the reason why cons work in the first place is because of human optimism on some level, right? We all want to, on some level, we want to find what feels like magic in the world. So there's this willingness to sort of suspend disbelief or suspend maybe good judgment or more objective judgment because you want this thing that seems amazing to actually be true.
Right.
So in a way, I think what the balance becomes in life is to not get too, I mean, to maintain a certain operational intelligence around not getting scammed, right? But also the flip side of that is to then not lose the wonderment and natural curiosity about the world that kind of makes things seem magical, and which is the thing that actually allows people to then fall into these things, these cons, right? So that's I think that's what it is going into it. It's, yeah, I try and be aware and I try and be practical, but also not to the detriment of just turning off the switch entirely of like, oh, this, you know, the world can be, I mean, the world is an insane place, right? It's right. There are things about it that are just sometimes things happen that do seem amazing, that seem miraculous, you know, and that's part of the thing that you don't want to get, I think, too jaded about and lose access to. So that's, yeah, it's it becomes a little bit of a balancing act, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think cynicism and suspicion of humanity is definitely an inspiration killer. So, you know, I think as we write these stories about criminals and deviants and murderers and so on and so forth, we're also writing about real people with a full spectrum of experiences and feelings. And, you know, it's not as black and white as, you know, stylized movies or biased documentaries might lead you to believe. And, you know, again, going back to the kind of complexity of character that interests both of us, you know, that definitely keeps me inspired on the page. I would say, you know, between you and I've always been the more skeptical, cynical person. And, you know, I adore you for your, you know, faith in people and patience. And
well, you know,
maybe we present it differently. You know, I kind of wear my anxiety on my sleeve, I think, in a way that you don't.
Yeah, no, I just tamp mine down to where it's, I'm just always on the brink of, you know, madness. That's all.
Right. Yeah. Just simmering.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Just simmering. Yeah.
But you know, this book, Trust Issues, was really, I think, born out of, you know, multiple things that we had in common in our kind of interest pool. But when I was in my 30s, I had a very good friend who got conned, and it was a romance con, and it was extensive. And I won't go into the details here because it's really her story to tell. And it's my hope that she can come on the show eventually and tell it.
That'd be great.
But, you know, the degree and levels of this con and the destruction that it had on my friend's life in every sense was so destabilizing, you know, to see how like one person could do that much damage, you know. So that was really kind of a launching point. And I hope she writes a book about her experience one day, because it's really incredible. And she's come out on the other side, you know, beautifully.
Yeah, good.
And then, you know, in my day-to-day after writing this book, I am very conscious of, you know, who I share my information with and what I'm doing on the computer and, you know, even what I'm looking at on the internet or what I talk about, you know, in earshot of my phone. You know, it's the kind of technology aspect, because one of the characters is a former hacker. That really
who you wrote beautifully, by the way. I mean,
thank you.
I can't wait for readers to meet this character. It's so good.
Well, she was really fun to write, but like kind of getting into that world, the amount of technology based scams is, just kind of mind blowing. It's just so pervasive, and we do so much online, whether it's handheld or sitting at your desk. So there's that. And then, interestingly, last week when I was thinking about have I ever really been scammed that, to a degree that I've really felt it? Because that's the other thing, is people are getting scammed all the time, every day, in different ways.
Sure.
They just don't realize it, whether it's subscriptions that are renewing even after you've canceled them, whether it's, emails that say they're from one person, but they're really from another. It's just stuff like that. And I was in the Target parking lot where nothing good happens.
No.
And, I've got like an armful of toddler and bags, and this lovely young woman comes kind of bounding over to me and says like, "Hey, can I have you for a second?" And for whatever reason, my, spidey sense went off. And I was like, I'm kind of in a rush right now. And then she just launched into it. And she's like, "I'm with a group. It's a church group. We're trying to get funding for this year abroad for students, and I kind of wanted to hear her out. And I said, "Well, I don't have any cash on me," because that's like the first thing that just like baseline, don't give people cash. Who are having an alleged, cause. And then I said, "Show me like where I can donate online," and I will. And so I pulled out my phone, and she gave me the name of the organization. And when I typed it into Google, it had the name of the organization, and then it said scam.
There it is. Yep.
So I said, "Okay, I got it. I'll put something through as soon as I get everything in the car." So off she goes. And then I see in this like parking lot, there are multiple young, lovely, enthusiastic people getting people at their cars and trying to get them to donate. So of course I come home and I do a deep dive, and it's like an offshoot of the 70s cult, the Moonies, the Unification Church. Yeah, and it's like a whole thing. And, I'm glad I didn't donate. It probably wouldn't have been a lot of money, but it just reminded me that like these, imposters exist everywhere all the time. And, you can make the decision to kind of buy into it or not. But what fascinates me, of course, is like, who is this girl and how did she get here and what is she doing, like walking up to people in parking lots? And then my writer brain starts going, and I see another person doing it, and it's a young man, and he's talking to a guy who looks like a serial killer. And this serial killer looking guy looks like he is like a cat with a canary. And I'm thinking, well, this is not a good setup, because you're sending out like eager kids who are like proselytizing to donate to some fake thing, and then they're talking to like real life psychopaths. So this is where my insanity goes. I went from like low level scam to full out sequel to Silence of the Lambs.
Yes. Classic.
So maybe I just better stop answering that question. I don't even think I answered the question. I'm sorry.
Well, you kept it close to the vest, which sounds like, your research on the world of con artistry. You pulled a good lesson out of that one.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
Well
and it will be throughout, this season. Hopefully we can relay and relate some of these findings, because there are a lot.
Sure.
I mean,
for sure.
My husband got conned in the course of us writing this book, which we'll do in another episode.
Yeah. Does that qualify as meta?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it does, right? Is that a meta situation?
Yes.
Incredible.
So should we, I know one of the things we want to do is Imposter of the Week.
Yeah, let's do Imposter of the Week. I love Imposter. Okay, so I'll kick us off for Imposter of the Week for our inaugural episode. And Great. By the way, this has been fantastic. So thank you for, having the conversation. Thanks for everyone out there who is listening to this. Yes. We are very excited for conversations with authors and creatives and people whose work we love and people who we have come to know and love, and just kind of seeing how everyone gets down. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
And hit us up if you're a creator, an artist, a writer, and you want to talk about any one of these ideas or all of them.
Yes.
We'll probably hit you up too. But
yeah, we would love to have you. Okay, so for this week's Imposter of the Week, I am nominating Andrew Scott from Netflix's sensational new adaptation of Ripley, based, of course, on the Patricia Highsmith character, the iconic character. Many of you may know him from the books and or the Talented Mr. Ripley project with Matt Damon years ago. But if you have not watched the new Netflix series, watch it. Andrew Scott, who you may know as a hot priest from the Fleabag series, phenomenal there, phenomenal here. Firstly, visually, it's incredible. It's all shot in black and white. It has this beautiful, I wish I knew offhand who the cinematographer was, but they shoot it beautifully. And it's also, it's gorgeous to look at. And it's an 8-parter, so you have much more runway in order to build the characters and build the story. And what's beautiful about it is there's so much tension built into it that they can afford to give it this sort of languid pace in sections, which gives you more time with Andrew Scott's character and the interpretation of Ripley, where there are these beautiful sequences where you're kind of given the gift of watching the gears turn in his head. So you start to get an idea of how he's looking at any situation, how he's breaking it down, what he's going to do. But he also gives this incredible investment in terms of the character, where he's at once very, very human and vulnerable, and also this kind of unrelenting psychopath, right? So you can see the dichotomy of that, and you really are invested in it. You really are pulling for this guy who on paper is not a particularly redeemable character, but you also see the way he has been, the way he's keyed into this world of privilege and affluence, and the way he's just trying to work the angles however he can. It's a wonderful depiction of a character that you probably feel like you know pretty well already. It's worth it. And again, just it's, visually it's gorgeous. The ensemble cast is great, and the writing is really, really top notch. So I would jump on that.
And it all takes place in like Italy.
Yeah. So it's
backdrop is just stunning.
Absolutely. Yeah. Beautiful scenery setting. Nice way to globetrot.
Well, that is an awesome first imposter of the week. I will do my best to, top that, or at least stay at the same level next week with my choice. Well, thank you, Greg. This has been a pleasure. And I'm really excited. I already know of some incredible guests we have lined up. We're just going to need to get them in the studio, so to speak. And we'll be trying to basically put these out once a week starting in July. So
yes, exactly.
I guess by the time this is out, this may be a little bit ahead of that. This is a little bit of a preview, but yeah, I think we're going to have a really cool lineup of people. Just want to thank some people and give some information about who is behind this. Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Kate Hergott, who started the Bookwild Collective with her podcast Between the Lines, where she interviews authors about their books and writing processes. She later merged it with her thriller podcast, Killing the Tea, to create Bookwild, which features author interviews and discussions with bookstagrammers and booktubers, and finds Kate sharing her passion for the power of stories. We are so thrilled to be teaming up with her for this buddy podcast. We've been on both of her podcasts, and Kate, it's because of you that we got our act together to do this.
That's right.
We also wanted to do a shout out to our incredible theme music composed by Scott Leeds, who is also an author extraordinaire and will be on the show. And we are also wanting to thank our forthcoming logo by the amazing designer, Steve Loma. Is that right?
Yeah, Loma. Yeah.
Great. And do you want to tell everyone how they can find us?
All right. So yes, you can find us on IG at Imposter Hour Podcast, and online at imposterhour.com. Thank you again, Kate, and thank you, Liz, and thank you all for listening.